Hi, Jacob.
Hey, Will.
How you doing?
I'm pretty good. How are you?
I'm great. You do that? Do you go by Jacob or Jake?
I go by Jacob.
You
Well,
go by...
my mother calls me Jake.
Yeah.
My grandmother calls me Jake. Everyone else pretty much Jacob.
Okay. I somehow sensed something like that in the book where the narrator is named Peter and hates it when people call him Pete. But
yeah. That may be. It's one of those subtle bits drawn from real life.
Mm-hmm. Well, welcome everyone to the latest. What do you call it? Episode? I don't know. Of Free Will. I'm Will Wilkinson. I have with me Jacob Bacharach. Is that how you say it?
That is
Bacharach.
Yeah. Yes.
The author of The Bend of the World, a new novel. It was published in April. Is that right?
Yes, April.
By Lipsyte. Is that how they say it? Is it Liverite or Livrite?
There's a sort of a subtle schwa on the E. Liverite.
Liverite, so, a division of W.W. Norton. It is I would say a comic novel set in Pittsburgh. There's a literal and figurative undercurrent of I don't know what you'd call supernatural doings or a suspicion of supernatural goings on.
Preternatural, extranatural.
Preternatural, extranatural. What's the difference between extranatural and supernatural? I don't know.
I'm not. Super implies maybe a position of superiority as opposed to a extranatural being a side by side comparison maybe.
The work
parallel stream
is soaked in intimations of a reality beyond our own, which are emanating from I don't know what you'd call it. I was like the Buffy the Vampire reference, like a hellmouth, or the confluence of the three rivers in Pittsburgh is actually the confluence of four rivers. One of them runs underground, and according to certain, maybe a little bit crazy people, this is a site of extraordinary energies that leads to very strange goings on in Pittsburgh. Do you live in Pittsburgh?
I do. Yes.
And why? I guess is a natural question.
A wonderful question. My boyfriend and I ask ourselves that question frequently. No, I love Pittsburgh. I grew up around here, in both in the city and then in some little kind of former post-industrial Rust Belt, old coal mining type towns, sort of within the 50-mile radius of the city. And I like to tell people that I got too stoned as an undergraduate to have any career plans or plans of any sort after I finished college. So I just moved back to Pittsburgh, where my family was, and I knew my way around. I didn't have to learn new directions in a new city, and happened into a pretty decent day job here, and so I've just stuck around ever since. Real estate's cheap.
Real estate's cheap. Well, I can appreciate that. We've just moved to Chattanooga and now have a house for which we're paying less than our apartment in Houston. And Houston isn't expensive at all either. So it's there's a lot to be said for inexpensive real estate. Well, throughout this is a really situated book. It's very deeply embedded in Pittsburgh. The protagonist, Peter, is coming on 30. He works at a sort of mysterious corporate entity doing nothing in particular, and comes from a little bit of money that has mysterious and maybe dubious background, but is deeply rooted in Pittsburgh. And there's a lot in the book that there just shows an intimacy and an affection for Pittsburgh.
Well, as I get used to talking about the book, if you didn't mention, it's my first novel, so I'm still learning how to talk about one's novel. my own novel. So as I learned how to talk about it, one of the things, the stories I've sort of been recycling in every interview is this, the idea of writing this sort of sad young literary men hanging around Brooklyn novel has been done before frequently and probably better than I would do it. I wanted to give the book a real place, and Pittsburgh. I mean, first of all, I'm familiar with it, being a native in effect. But it's also just a very strange, sort of geographically, topographically, and culturally, this very strange little corner of America, at once sort of Eastern, but also very Appalachian in a lot of ways. And it's just an interesting geography for this type of story that sort of straddles between the sort of actual and perhaps not so actual world.
Mm-hmm. So when did you set to work on The Bend of the World?
Let's see. I sort of had been writing around a couple of the characters in the book, and actually sort of along with some friends of mine, some real friends of mine who live here, sort of noodling around with the sort of central conspiracy theory in the book. The sort of there's a conspiracy theory that sort of is parallel to the actual plot, such as it is of the book. So it was just sort of one of those things that existed in little sketches and in late night drunken jokes for a few years. And then, as I think Will, I was blogging for many years, pseudonymously blogging as a crackpot, anarcho-capitalist curmudgeon. And one of the
and what was your name? Tell people, because I'm sure some of our viewers followed your blog.
Yeah. So the blog was called Who is IOZ? IOZ was the name, the name of the sort of authorial character. I described him actually to my editor of my book, Will. I described IOZ as maximum me, sort of like my sort of id out stalking around the internet. So I had been writing that blog for quite a while, and the guy who's now my editor, Will Menaker, he was a reader of the blog, and we had, as bloggy types do, communicated via email and so forth and so on. And I had made some vague intimations about having another writing project other than this blog, and he wrote to me and said, "Well, what is it? Is it fiction? Is it a book?" And I said, "Sort of." And that sort of led to him asking to see something, and that led to me actually writing something. So I would say that to get back to your question, the actual genesis of the novel was probably about 3 years in the making. The actual writing of it, probably about 5 or 6 months.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's fast.
Yeah, I write quickly.
So had you been writing fiction before this? You characterize IOZ, which I was always calling IOZ to myself, but I didn't know you called it I. But if you were sort of, IOZ is maximal you, so it's kind of an authorial persona that, I don't know. So those are your views kind of turned up to 11, or?
Yeah, I would say those are my views turned up to 11 or 12. Most of them. I mean, it's the internet. It's blogging, so you can't resist the occasional disingenuous troll. But
yeah, your id really does deplore Matt Iglesias, say.
Well, my even my superego, I think, deplores Matt Iglesias, or disapproves, maybe is
okay.
super egoic way to put it. I think he's unforgivably glib, but in any case,
I love him to pieces.
Well, I'll resist the urge to say
I'm baiting you.
Too many terrible things. In any case, I didn't think about the work that I was doing at IOS as being fictional. Like I said, I thought of that character as a persona, but in the same way that God only knows that drive time talk radio host is also a persona of sorts. I had been writing fiction, just not particularly successfully. I mean, as an undergrad, way back when at Oberlin, I was a poet. I mean, I studied English literature and creative writing, and wrote almost exclusively poetry, other than the sort of obligatory fiction workshop to the major. But then I quickly kind of after school grew disenchanted with poetry, mostly because I just kept getting rejected from the poetry journals, and I thought, fuck this. I don't want to. These people don't know what they're talking about, and to prove it, I'm going to stop writing poetry. So, which I did for the most part. And I kind of wrote a couple of abortive attempts at novels prior to this one, none of which were particularly good, though there were bits that eventually got recycled into this one. I always sort of was an, I guess, aspirant fiction writer, but not a very regularly practicing one until I started working on The Bend of the World.
Well, let's give a rundown of the book. Like, can you tell us your sort of capsule summary of the plot, the arc of the book, without spoiling anything?
Yeah, no. I will attempt to do so without no spoilers. Fortunately, the book is not especially plot driven. I suppose there are some turns and surprises in it, but it's not it's not a whodunit. So mostly not a whodunit. So, but in any case, The Bend of the World is a sort of late. Delayed adolescence coming of age novel. As you'd said earlier, the main character is about 30, almost 30. He turns 30 in the novel. It is the story of him sort of bumping along comfortably in this sort of banal corporate job, one of those sort of middle management white collar jobs that neither do nor produce anything. Still hanging out with his old kind of high school, college buddies, drinking a lot, smoking a lot of weed, eating a lot of mushrooms, going to parties that his sort of rich but not quite as rich as they used to be family can get him into, and all around kind of being a sort of lackadaisical wastrel of a millennial hipster. And then two things happen to sort of shock him out of that. One of them is he meets a slightly older couple who he will become with whom he will become intimately involved. The man of the couple actually gets involved in Peter's corporate job, and then subsequently they see a UFO, which is the sort of sign and wonder of the book. And Peter, the protagonist and the narrator, falls into a sort of dual conspiracy, one of which is a capitalist conspiracy to loot the company where he works. That's the sort of real conspiracy in a sense. And the other of which is a bizarre science fiction, esoteric, magical conspiracy to tap into the mystical powers that are emanating from the sort of axis mundi at the confluence of the rivers here in Pittsburgh, in order to bring about some sort of nebulous but probably nefarious end. And those two strands of conspiracy sort of intertwine and wind around each other, as do Peter's sort of two distinct sets of friends and acquaintances throughout the book, until ultimately until ultimately nobody quite learns the lesson that they probably ought to have learned. That's not exactly a capsule review, but I think that hits the high points.
Yeah. So Peter's best friend from childhood, Johnny, is this sort of really far gone drug addict / conspiracy theorist who's deep in the weeds on all of this crazy stuff that had conspiracy that happened like during mid-century, where the CIA and the Carnegies and the like all the this confluence of corporate and state power is trying to like figure out how to break apart the dimensions so that I don't know what it is, so that you can select which possible future we want to be in or something like that, like which would be ultimate power, I guess. The details of it really aren't important for the story, but his friend is really profoundly into this stuff, always trying to get him interested, and he's not interested.
Or he is interested. I guess he's a kind of a funny character because he has this long time friendship with Johnny. They've known each other actually since childhood, and he kind of is into this stuff, though not nearly so much. He at least is willing to entertain it as a sort of bit of joking repartee with his friend, but he doesn't really. He's not a true believer, and he part of his tension as a character is that he's trying to. That's the sort of world of his childhood, hanging out with this weirdo, doing a lot of drugs and talking about, about whether a flying saucer is from another planet or from another dimension. That's the sort of the childish things that he sort of desires to put away, and that's actually one of the things that really impels his relationship when he meets Mark, who's this older guy, sort of corporate attorney type. Who ends up kind of working against for the company where Peter works. One of the things that impels Peter's friendship with him is this desire to get away from Johnny. He sees this other person who's sort of like adult, who lives in a beautiful apartment, has a beautiful girlfriend, is more sophisticated, and is not just some weirdo banging around the dive bars of Pittsburgh, and that's sort of enticing to him, in part also because of his background, because he comes from money, and so he perceives that as being the way that one is supposed to live one's life. But maybe part of the joke of the book is that in some ways ends up being much more sort of spirit-crushing and evil and nefarious than the perhaps real, perhaps unreal plot to break apart the quantum dimensions and achieve total control over the historical timeline.
Yeah, well, so it's a lot of the book, as I read it, is a book about kind of late 20s obliviousness, and the paranormal or extranatural stuff that's running through it is, it's an intimation of there being truths that aren't acknowledged, that there's being deeper secret truths behind the world that people are too lazy to see. And in Johnny, his conspiracy theorist friend, he's, there's always this, like, when are you going to wake up? When are you going to when are you going to open your eyes, right? When are you going to, and even if that stuff doesn't actually pan out to be as the real reality, there's a lot that Peter actually is oblivious to. There are these sort of mysterious and malign forces that surround and sort of structure his life. So he's kind of blithe about his 9 to 5, sitting in his cubicle reading blogs job, and has this kind of intellectual appreciation of the depredations of the capitalist system, but actually just kind of considers it as, a kind of, if not a benign fact of the world, just something that's a force beyond doing anything about it, something that you just have to accommodate yourself to. But when Mark comes along, and Mark, I don't think giving anything away in the story, is an agent, is a quasi lawyer who's facilitating like a big this big Dutch company is buying out Peter's company, and they're just gonna gut it. And there's something soulless and ominous about the Dutch conglomerate, who we at some point learn were collaborated with the Nazi regime in the past. And we also learn that Peter's family has a history of Nazi collaboration as well. And so you get the sense that they're really like that. He really is surrounded by these in dark forces and truths that he's only now waking up to, and the supernatural or whatever you want to call it plot seemed to me to sort of like run in parallel as this kind of, like, what's the real secret knowledge or the real reality that he's not able to wake up to.
Yeah, and he's very resistant. I mean, Johnny at one point tells him, "You're the only person who could see a UFO and become even more normal," which is sort of Peter's reaction. As weird things begin happening, his first reaction is to treat them as if they're not, or to treat them in the same sort of blasé way that he treats his job at this company, where he doesn't do anything. But yeah, it's about he knows intellectually. I mean, he sits around reading blogs all day, so of course he knows intellectually what's going on in the sort of system of late state capital. He would, I'm sure, flatter himself as a sort of semi-radical political thinker.
He toys around. He tells people that he's a libertarian. Doesn't really believe it because he thinks they won't let him get away with calling himself an anarchist.
Well, he's not even really. I mean, he's not an anarchist either. I mean, in fact, he says at one point, "I wasn't anything."
Yeah.
But it was easier to tell his mother that he's a libertarian, because his mother is very sort of traditionally up by the bootstraps conservative, a sort of Catholic conservative.
She chalks his libertarianism up to the fact that he didn't have to pay for college himself, right?
Yes, she tells him that libertarians. Well, at first she tells him that libertarians are liberals without student debt.
That's it. Yeah.
And then she tells him that once he leaves his the sort of libertinage of his 20s behind and becomes boring, then he'll just be a conservative, because that is the inevitable outcome. And were it not for all of the strange things that sort of end up happening to Peter, that probably would be the case. She's probably correct. But he doesn't. He's not really interested in where. It's one thing to abstractly observe that capitalism is evil. It's another thing to actually do anything about it. I mean, he's perfectly happy sitting in his office making $60,000 a year and reading blogs. And even once Mark comes along and they begin the process of basically chopping, Bain capitalizing this company, chopping it up and selling it for scrap. He sort of goes along, I won't say happily, but goes along without asking too many questions at first.
He becomes complicit in it.
Yeah. And
even ends up, firing one of his former colleagues, somebody who he's got a soft spot for.
And his boss, actually, the guy who he fires, right, is someone who he, earlier in the book, before Peter kind of had any power at the organization, he sort of works for this guy, and he considers him, a big kind of your classic, middle management, like doofus. He's some guy. He lives in the suburbs and he drives some big car and he's got a wife and kids and he probably likes to golf. And Peter thinks that he's a figure of fun. He's sort of ridiculous. And
I love the
much
passage describing that guy because we've all worked with that. he's one of those guys who I think you described him as, being a car nut and having, like signed autographs of race car drivers in his office, and it looked like a 10-year-old boy's bedroom. But it's the kind of person who actually like shops in earnest from, those catalogs that sell you inspirational posters, like success,
Yeah,
and
he's a nice guy. He's a nice guy who isn't deliberately, hurting anybody. He's just a sort of dummy, who in classic corporate fashion sort of advanced to the level of his own incompetence. But then once Peter gets promoted above this guy, he ends up being told to fire him, and he actually at first takes a little bit of sort of grotesque pleasure in doing it. It's the first time that Peter has ever actually sort of actively done anything in his working life, and he kind of likes it at first, and then he begins to think like that's actually one of the sort of emotional turning points.
Yeah, he comes home horny after firing the guy, and he tells his girlfriend, Lauren Sarah.
Yes.
Which is a great running joke about her. What's your name? Lauren Sarah. That's two names. And he's like, he's all fired up because he fired a guy, and she's like, why? Why would you be excited about that? And he's like, he didn't do anything. And she's like, what do you mean he didn't? Like just reminding him of the absurdity of judging someone's value in this way in a corporate environment where nobody's doing anything.
Right.
And he has
Peter's not doing. Nobody's doing anything. I mean, that's he said that's the sort of the sort of joke of it all is that none of them knows what they're doing. And Peter hasn't been doing anything. And his girlfriend Lauren Sarah, she of the two names, she's kind of a bit more. She's an artist. She's a grad student. She's a bit of a hippie. And to her mind, it's like, well, that's everybody should just get paid to not do anything. I mean, why? What's wrong with that? And that was also sort of Peter's animating principle until, of course, my personal opinion is that that's actually sort of an animating principle for a lot of sort of like cogs in the sort of corporate machinery of America in this day and age, which is that nobody does much of anything until you get a little bit of power and authority. You take one step up the sort of hierarchical rung, and then all of a sudden you start talking about efficiencies and outputs and benchmarks and metrics and wondering who it is that you ought to fire.
Change.
Yeah, I mean, I should say I have an MBA as well. So.
Oh. Yeah. Okay. So how much of this? I mean, it can be a tedious question, but like, how much of this reflects your own experience? Is this an experience you've had working as a cog in a corporate environment, or?
Well, so not really. My day job, such as it is, I mean, I am, I suppose, a middle manager in the grand scheme of things. But I mean, I work for a nonprofit cultural organization. We manage theaters and art galleries and do sort of urban development stuff. So so my job is actually pretty okay. I think I do some things. I'm pretty sure I do. That have some measurable outputs.
You deliver measurables?
What's that?
You deliver measurables.
Yes, I'm sure that my dashboard is very green. But in any case, I did, when I first moved back to Pittsburgh, after undergrad, after college, I did work like every English major. For probably, I guess it was maybe for like 6 to 8 months, I worked basically as a temp document researcher at a law firm, a big evil corporate law firm. we were actually I was working on this big litigation. We were literally defending an evil corporation that had poisoned the farmer's well. So I did take from that experience a bit. I definitely stole from the experience of B school, business school, not so much the actual internal dynamics of the company. The company in the book is called Global Solutions.
Solutions for a Global World.
Solutions for a Global World, yeah. But many of the character types that I sort of placed in and about that company.
There's a particular business school kind of ethos.
In fact, the character that Peter fires is actually, he's sort of a perpetual, he tells everyone he has an MBA, but he's never actually finished his degree. Yeah. He's a person who puts MBA after his name in the email signature. So in any case, in Pittsburgh, called Free Markets, which was kind of this like go-go 90s, international logistics management company. And I stole a lot of that for the sort of creation of Global Solutions. In fact, the whole story of the company sort of being bought out and taken apart has a lot taken from that sort of real corporate radar, late 90s, early 2000s period here in Pittsburgh from that particular company.
Yeah, there's also
I don't know what they did either. Free Markets. I mean, but it's like a perfect name for this sort of weird corporate entity.
Yeah, you also show in the book a deep familiarity with the art world, and I guess that comes from the kind of job that you do have, like working in a cultural. Are you embedded in the art world in Pittsburgh?
Yeah, I think I am. I mean, I had a lot of friends, I still do, who were either directly or sort of tangentially involved in that world. But that part of that is just the interest in the sort of I hate the word realistic. I try not to use it, but I'll use it anyway. The sort of realistic depiction in the city of Pittsburgh and in this particular social milieu, like those types of cultural institutions, museums, and the art galleries and the theaters drive a lot of the sort of social life of a mid-sized city like this one does, and those are the sort of natural. The places naturally have, like the 20 something hipsters and the well-to-do suburban enclave museum donor types sort of all running and the evil corporate lawyers, all sort of running into each other in the same place in the same room. So part of that was just the sort of realistic mechanics of the way that those different social circles overlap in a city like this one. But also I had some good friends who've worked through, your typical sort of like Biennale type exhibits at museums, and I always thought that world was completely hysterical.
Yeah,
certainly great for some satire.
The character Mark, who's the sort of like mysterious lawyer-like entity representing the Dutch, acquisition. At the beginning of the book, he goes on this great jag about why he hates art that I found completely delightful.
Yeah. Well, that's right. He's ironically his girlfriend is an artist, a sort of semi well-known artist who'd had a bit of a reputation in New York, where they lived previously before they moved. Although it's sort of implied frequently throughout the book that that A, she was never quite that successful, and B, her sort of decline from whatever success she had was the result of her own fondnesses for drugs and alcohol and various other types of infidelity. So it's ironic that Mark talks about hating artists so very much. I've always thought that he, I mean, though it says this nowhere in the book, but in my own sort of personal conception of that character, I always thought that he would have some sort of like, if he is in fact a human being, and if he is in fact from the planet Earth, which is itself another question in the book, I think. If that were the case,
it is
I always thought he
suggested
would
that if he's not an agent of the Dutch, he might be an agent of emissaries from the mysterious other dimension.
Yes, precisely. But if he is an agent of the Dutch, then I suspect he's got that sort of Hitlerian paintings of walls and bits of local architecture somewhere deep in his background, and that's why he hates contemporary art so very much. But like I said, that's my own theory about the character. I didn't bother to put that part in the book. But yeah, he himself has a sort of a number of sort of alien characteristics to him, and that's one of the jokes of the book, and one of the ways the sort of real reality and the conspiratorial reality, or the supernatural reality sort of overlap and intertwine, is that Mark is this, you never really quite learn whether or not he's just this sort of very predatory person whose sort of moral and physical alienness is just a sort of interpretation of that by Peter, who's telling you the story, or if in fact the sort of bizarre predatory nature of his humanity is indication, that somewhere underneath there is like an evil, evil alien reptile man, sent to Earth to drink our blood, or whatever it is that they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about there's a real richness of conceptualization and detail in the conspiracy theory that is incredibly entertaining. Can you relate to us some of what the conspiracy is? Because it's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And you make it sound like it's something that you had kind of worked out as a joke prior to writing the book.
Well, yeah, the real origin of it is several years ago, God, longer than that, 10 years ago at least, there was this great television show called Disinformation, which was hosted by this guy named Richard Metzger, and it was on British TV, and it was a sort of outgrowth of this big online clearinghouse for sort of conspiracy and culture jammer thought called disinfo.com, and it was this sort of kind of news magazine 60 minutes type show that just like delved into the world of the weird, and through that I became familiar with this amazing actual conspiracy theory out there called the Montauk Project, named after Montauk on Long Island, and it's this sort of everything in the kitchen sink conspiracy that involves everything from mind control to multiple dimensions, to hidden Nazi gold, to connections with the Philadelphia experiment. This sort of everything that you could imagine in a conspiracy is all in this conspiracy theory, which is ultimately was sort of codified into a set of like 6 or 7 semi-self-published books, and that was the real inspiration for the Pittsburgh project in the Bend of the World. So I sort of took that idea, that sort of like everything in history is this conspiracy, which is also, I mean, you see it in plenty of other literature as well, I mean, in the Illuminatus trilogy, or in Foucault's Pendulum, or, a lot of like other books have kind of done the same. And I just sort of relocated it to Pittsburgh, which does have this sort of bizarre occult history and topography, and was this sort of site for these kind of great, these sort of massive industrial fortunes, and a lot of sort of strange happenings through the early period of the development of the United States. And so the conspiracy is basically that starting, depending on who you ask, either sometime around the French and Indian War, or else sometime around the turn of the 20th century, or else sometime right after World War II, a group that's sort of comprised of both well-to-do industrial capitalists as well as various emissaries of the sort of deep state, CIA, OSS types, all get together in Pittsburgh and attempt through a vast magical working to tunnel through from one quantum reality to the next, from one universe to its sort of immediate parallel universe, to give themselves ultimate control over the timeline so that they can sort of travel up and down the timeline, picking and choosing those events or those eventualities or those probabilities which they desire to happen, and in so doing achieve total historical control, past, present, and future. And Peter's friend Johnny learns about these books, which are about this conspiracy, through a series of books which are being written by a local sort of science fiction author by the name of Winston Pringle, and he becomes quite obsessed with them. They slot right into his sort of pre-existing beliefs about the way that the universe works. Peter, on the other hand, thinks that they're like completely wacky and has no real interest in them at all. Johnny keeps trying to convince Peter to track down this author because he really wants to meet him. Mm-hmm. Peter's like keeps blowing him off. He's like, I don't want to meet this guy. I don't want to have anything to do with this. Eventually, we do meet Winston Pringle. The odd thing is that Peter, as he's sort of like gradually beginning to intimate that maybe he should think about like doing something with himself, about sort of improving his own personal, moral, ethical character, start thinking about his job and his relationships with his friends and his family and with the women in his life. He does sort of begin having these like intimations of like messages being filtered back to himself from his own future self, which is one of the things that the conspiracy suggests might be possible. So again, that's sort of like how it keeps coming back into his life, even though he keeps trying to shove it off to the side.
Yeah, one theory of the UFOs is that the UFOs are the outcome of the project coming back into the past to make sure the things that bring the project's outcome into being happen. Or that was a convoluted way of saying it, but yeah. So the UFOs are just really people from the future making sure that they have a future or have a now. Time is confusing.
Yeah. Sort of massive universe-long project to sort of avoid their own destruction via the destruction of the universe. So I thought that was like a really great science fiction trope to include, into a conspiracy. And it's also sort of just a joke about time travel plots in general, because I mean, it's the notion that sort of the past is a place that you can go to is so like completely incorrect, but it's such fertile ground for a story.
Yeah, if they had to come into the past to bring about their present, then they always did go back to the past to bring about their present, in which case their present and their past are identical. And it's so hard to think about.
Right. Well, it helps if you're on drugs.
It helps if you're on drugs. And there are a lot of drugs in this book, which is how the confusion that runs throughout the book between the real world and another world. There's a kind of blurring of lines between reality, and drugs is the medium that allows that sort of effacement, which keeps the reader, at least, even if you feel sort of sure that the drugs are doing most of the work, you're still never quite sure.
Yeah, it's well, there's a lot. I mean, one of and this applies sort of to the interest in conspiracies as well as to the actual physical intake of drugs. But there's a lot about addiction in the book, about people's the way that people use addiction or make addiction into a sort of substitute for other things in their lived lives. So Johnny is addicted to conspiracies, but he's also a complete kind of like degenerate drug addict. And Peter, it's another parallel because, you know, like Peter does a lot of drugs. I mean, one of the first scenes in the book is him, you know, swallowing a handful of psilocybin mushrooms before he goes to an opening.
He's reluctant. He's a reluctant heavy drug user.
He's a reluctant, yeah. He's a reluctant heavy drug. In fact, he goes on a sort of a page-long disquisition about how he despises psychedelic drugs and thinks they're ridiculous. But then because his girlfriend kind of like makes fun of him, he then takes a whole bunch of mushrooms anyway. So he's in the same way that he's always sort of disclaiming any interest in the sort of paranormal or in the world of conspiracy, and yet somehow is always getting involved in it. He is likewise always sort of setting himself up as this sort of like mild, you know, social drinker, social user of drugs, but in fact he's a very heavy drinker and very heavy user of drugs. But that's you know, again, it's kind of like in the history of that. The sort of like genre history, you know, the sort of like Philip K. Dick narrative of sort of that sort of parallel reality is often sort of at least catalyzed by the heavy use of psychotropic substances. And in fact, that's actually another part of the conspiracy, right? Yeah. Because the conspiracy itself, the sort of apparatus, the machine-like apparatus required for them to travel between dimensions actually requires a sexually aroused psychic to take a powerful time drug and then put himself into a sort of sensory deprivation chamber, and that's what allows him to sort of flip between realities.
Personally, that seems very plausible to me.
I mean, if it's gonna happen,
I feel like that's the way. If the world worked that way, that's the way the world would work. For sure.
I mean, you can see it's like after a rough day, like a rough day in front of like Dianne Feinstein, like John Brennan goes back to the CIA, you know, pops a cap and gets himself into a sensory deprivation chamber, you know, pulls one out, and it feels a lot better about himself. I don't know if he goes to an alternate dimension, but you know, I absolutely believe that our rulers and betters are floating around in dark tanks somewhere.
Well, that's one of the parallelisms that runs through the book, where there's this the narrator disparages this conspiracy theory while also relating it with a level of detail that belies his total disinterest in it. But at the same time, the narrator's description of real-world processes is fairly, you know, conspiratorial in a, but you know, in a realistic way. So the description of Pittsburgh politics is basically the description of an ongoing it's really. You know, that's where real conspiracies happen. You know, there was a story of someone who's considering running, and you know, the political machine gets the son arrested for possessing drugs, but they pin, you know, intent to distribute on him or something like that. And there's that kind of thing kind of just comes, you know, en passant as you go through this story. But that's the way the narrator believes the world works, that people in power are constantly abusing it to fuck other people over and to, you know, give themselves privileges. And the description of the way actual global capitalism operates is not friendly. And so there is this idea that the narrator definitely is committed to the idea that there constantly are conspiracies that explain the world of appearances, you know, once you scratch just a little bit. And that kind of explains the small amount of credence that he gives to these more implausible conspiracies.
Yeah, again, that's, a small you live in a small city for long enough, you start to become aware. It's like, the same family has been in charge of the Department of Public Works for 45 years.
Yeah.
Like, there's got to be, if it's not the Priory of Sion, there's something going on there.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, I don't know if the Illuminati are real, but I do know that the Costas are in charge of public works in the city of Pittsburgh. So, that sort of thing, those sorts of banal, minor conspiracies, conspiracy in the sense of like anytime, two people get together in a room and make a decision that affects someone else, that's a conspiracy in a very true sense.
When Peter becomes aware that his corporation is being bought and is going to be, parceled out, that all his and because he knows it before the rest of the people know it, that's why he gets promoted. He gets promoted on the condition that he not tell anybody what's going to happen. There is literally a conspiracy to disassemble the corporation for the benefit of whoever it is that runs this Dutch corporation, and he becomes implicated in the conspiracy and becomes an agent in the conspiracy and agrees to keep his mouth shut. Right? Like,
yes. Well, no. In fact, that's keep your mouth shut is exactly what he's told on several occasions. But that's anyone who's ever been through a round of layoffs, at their company can tell you that, like, at the last all staff meeting before the layoffs, the thing that the CEO tells everybody is, and we're definitely not thinking about layoffs right now. And as soon as he says that, that there are going to be like layoffs.
Everybody's like, ah.
Yeah, oh god. So and so that's what happens. That's the sort of conspiracy of in the takeover of global solutions. It's that there is a group of people who are the sort of central cadre of decision makers at this organization, and they all know what's going to happen, and they're sort of minions all know what's going to happen, and then the rest of the hundreds or thousands of people who work there don't know what's going to happen, and they don't learn what's going to happen until it happens to them. The guy Peter, when he gets promoted, he immediately thinks he's going to be fired. When he gets called up to the office upstairs, like his first thought is like, I've spent the last 5 years or whatever at this corporation, like sitting in front of my computer, reading blogs all day. So they finally found me out, and they're going to fire me. And instead he gets promoted, whereas his former boss, whom Peter fires, when he gets called upstairs to the office, his first thought is, oh, they're going to promote me. So it's like that's there's a sort of conspiracy of expectations as well. And
I really enjoyed the characterization of the whole corporation. I really liked the minor characters, the security guard who kind of has a combinatorial code of catchphrases, was utterly charming. The director of HR, who is in fact the wisest person in the entire institution, because she would be the only one who actually knows what is happening to everyone, because she's the nexus of the paperwork. I liked all of those characters who just play a marginal role in this story. Gave you the feeling of reality.
Yeah, I mean, my favorite character. One of the characters, one of the people with whom Peter works is someone else named Peter, who everyone refers to as the other Pete, who frequently dispenses a sort of exercise and holistic health advice to Peter, particularly because Peter is frequently wandering into the office with a crushing hangover, and the other Pete is always sort of blissfully removing his kombucha from the shared refrigerator.
Yeah.
And
dude, try kombucha. Yeah.
yeah. Peter asks him at one point, what do you do for a hangover? And he says, I go for a swim. Peter's like, I'll stick with coffee, thanks. So, but that's, the book is populated not just at the office, but throughout with those those sort of secondary characters who I think really give it life and give it texture, because I think most of us have a relatively small, actually sort of close affinity group of people with whom we have like real long-term ongoing interactions, but there are a lot of people who sort of move in and out of our lives, at work, at the bar, in the sort of political life of the communities that we live in, and you see those people and they're like part of the texture of any individual's life, and so I wanted to make certain that they were accounted for.
Yeah, the book is like really sharply observed, and because of that, extremely funny. I mean, like the Peter's whole family is hilarious. He's got this kind of clueless dad who only cares about like wine, Yale, baseball. I think he said like a descending order, and it's just kind of this kind of oblivious sweetheart. And his mom is this kind of ball-busting surgeon, and his grandmother is this really sharp, obsessed with all her ailments, but smarter than everybody else in the. And you show love for the imperious woman.
Yes, there are. Well, all of the men in the book have something sort of irredeemably wrong with them, and the women do tend to be sharper. I mean, Peter's mother, her greatest fear for Peter is that he will follow his father's footsteps in marrying a woman who is his intellectual and vocational superior, which gives you insight into how she thinks, about her own husband. And his grandmother is the sort of doyen.
His mother's intolerance for her husband and his tolerance for her intolerant reactions are just, it's just delightful.
Yeah, those were fun characters to fun people to write. And and Nanette, his grandmother, is also fun. She is the sort of mater familias in a way, although she's in constant competition with Peter's own mother. But she's the sort of long-standing supporter of the arts and culture, and is the one who sort of gets Peter involved in that world, and it gets him the invites to all the good parties. And then Peter's girlfriend, Lauren Sarah, who, because you're seeing her through Peter's eyes, is sort of presented as being this sort of like insufferable, hippy-dippy, graduate conceptual artist. Actually, in the end, is another character who's sort of like one of the few sort of like emotionally and intellectually redeemable people who you encounter in the book, and she in many ways is also sort of, even though not in the way that Peter's mother thinks about her, she is in many ways Peter's sort of superior as well, just sort of like an all-around more ethical and decent person than he is, at least through the first portion of the book, even though she herself is kind of sort of an hysterical person, a lot of affectations.
So who this is a hard question, like, who were your inspirations going into this? Like, you got a nice blurb from Sam Lipsyte. I felt a bit of Sam Lipsyte in here, who's one of my favorite authors. But like, you mix a little Sam Lipsyte in with a little sort of Thomas Pynchon conspiracy craziness or something like that, but like taking it slightly less seriously.
Yeah. Although, it's sort of early. Like, I really like the crying of Lot 49, and then I'm sort of one of those people who admit, like, to sort of like getting about 3/4 of the way through Gravity's Rainbow and being like, I'll finish this later. And it's 10 years later. Here I am.
I feel like you did really well. You got how far through?
I do like Sam Lipsyte, although actually his one novel, The Ask, is sort of near and dear to my own heart, because it actually does sort of deal with my sort of day job life, mm-hmm. sort of life in the world of like asking people for money foundations, in some ways I would say, obviously, people like like Philip K. Dick were big inspirations to me. In that sort of interweaving of the sort of paranoid, supernatural or extranatural world with drugs, with sort of banal, lived reality. I was actually really inspired by Joshua Ferris's first book. Then we came to the end, which was, if you don't remember, was a sort of workplace novel set in like the late 90s, told in this first-person plural voice about this sort of group of office drones.
That's a terrific novel.
Yeah, it's a great novel. That sort of workplace novel was really, really interesting to me. I was as I was editing the book, I was reading the Flamethrowers by Rachel Kushner, another like super terrific book. I keep telling people when I talk about that book that I'm super jealous, because like I really wish that I could write that book, but somebody's already written it. But it was very helpful as I was like kind of working my way through crystallizing some of the art world stuff here. She engages with it in a much like more direct and somewhat less satirical way, but definitely with like a real edge of humor. And that was very helpful. To sort of like try, it was helpful in that it sort of was like, you can make fun of these people without looking down on them. I think there's a tendency in a lot of like contemporary American fiction to sort of like sneer through the scrim of your authorial voice at the characters whom you're writing about. And I like the people in this book, even the really terrible people in this book. I really like them. I'd hang out with them. I'd have a beer with them. Even the mayor's sort of consigliere, Jonah Kansky, I would definitely have a beer with that guy. I mean, there's actually, this is sort of an odd one, but I was also really inspired by Conrad's The Secret Agent, which is I think gets short shrift compared to a lot of his other novels, but it's actually it's hysterical. I mean, it's the story of an anarchist. Sort of an anarchist, but who's really an agent for foreign government in London, orchestrating this. They attempt to bomb the astronomical observatory at Greenwich, and it goes horribly awry. He's pursued by this sort of this police inspector. There are all these kind of goofy minor level politicos in it, and like I said, it's just like devastatingly funny, like laugh out loud funny. And it was really sort of in creating the sort of world of Pittsburgh, especially the sort of nefarious political world. I definitely went back to that book a lot.
Oh, well, I'll have to. I'm a huge fan of Conrad's, but I've never picked that one up.
Yeah, it's definitely worth it. It would make a great movie. It'd be Verloc, who is the anarchist at the sort of heart of the book, is like a role made for John Goodman.
Well, you should get in touch with his agent.
I know.
Well, Jacob, I think we're out of time, but I just wanted to say thanks for coming on and tell people that it's The Bend of the World, available from all finer booksellers. It's a hilarious book that if you're recently come out of your late 20s, early 30s, worked at the you will recognize it. And if you're interested in Pittsburgh, or if you are a fan of IOS, there's definitely a hint or two of that in here as well, which I loved. Some Iosian rants peppered throughout the text, which were a real pleasure to read. So thanks, Jacob.
Thank you, Will.
And good luck with the book. I hope you sell 1 trillion copies.
I hope I sell 1 trillion copies too.
I mean, that would take all the mass in the universe, maybe, but there'd be a worse way to go.
Thanks, Will.
All right, take care.